podcast, we're going to be going over the hot button term of fake news. I know it ends up getting tossed out there all the time, but we're going to be starting with what was the term originally with it and where it comes on with history. Now, fake news has been around there a lot longer than people have actually understood. Because first of all, we need to understand that it doesn't come around. It has not been just within this weaponized thing where people try to accuse Trump of this war on the media. This thing has gone on for a long time. We see people such as Frank Zappa, who basically stated even back in 1991 and was even talking about it back in the 1970s and even some parts of the 1960s that this was going on with basically this kind of mix of the legacy media and the stuff that was going on in the classrooms, because they were trying to essentially change what was really going on to create a placid group of people so they would continue working and become obedient again in the factories. This has always been kind of like this situation of the owners of the country essentially that are essentially part of this ownership group want to that have actually created a lot of these special interests. They want essentially that are pushing for larger government. They essentially want this to continue. Now, there's other people that say, if you go with larger government, we can eliminate this, but that's just basically you're just adding more and more problems to this unit. But what this is basically about is he was calling out, and a lot of other people back then were calling out basically what was happening through propaganda. Now, this was basically the old term of it. Essentially, the media was using propaganda. They weren't doing their job. They weren't calling out people back then for what they were doing. And this was happening back then with military action. This was happening back then with covering up what was really going on. I mean, if you look at the history of what we had with FDR, they basically, a lot of historians from that era that essentially wrote a lot of the history books, they made FDR look like this great leader, when in fact what we really know is he was a racist that basically believed that anybody that wasn't white Anglo-Saxon Protestant was essentially a waste on the economy, and he wanted them gone. And this was the way that he was. He was a horrible, horrible person. He hated immigrants. He hated non-white people. And he was very, very pro-war. He would go to war. He would intervene in any section that he possibly could. He was against the idea of capitalism. He was very, very pro working with Mao in China and with Stalin in Russia, but had reluctancies to actually work with Churchill in the United Kingdom. And this is what we see is they make him out to be this person that they flip the story where they make him out to say that he was very, very willing to work with Churchill, when you can see in photographs that he did not care for Churchill. And they totally erase the fact that he had communicated with Mao on several occasions to harass Japan. Now, this harassment ended up leading to the bombing of Pearl Harbor, because Japan was sick and tired of us blockading them from getting any type of supplies for their people, and from the actual military attacks from China that was actually coming on a day-to-day basis. And eventually they got mad and attacked us. And historians try to state that they were essentially unprovoked. Well, that wasn't the case. And this is what you would call essentially fake news. Yes, it's done from a historical point, but this is still fake news. and this is what many of these people were talking about. And what we see with it is these numbers weren't exactly something that were small. Even with Gallup's numbers, the highest that they've ever seen is a 28% disapproval would be the lowest numbers that they've seen with it. A 72% approval rating would be the highest that they've ever seen. That was in 1976. That was during the highly skeptical point of the Nixon Watergate scandal, which was, there's a lot of questions going around that, whether that was actually honestly done and if that was a setup or not. Because there's a lot of people that have come out stating that that was possibly a setup. And we need to further investigate that to see whether that holds true. And if it does, that would essentially cause people to essentially have fallen for essentially a big hoax back then. Because even those people that even benefited from that are considered to be quite suspect with any of their writings since then, with Woodward and Bernstein, who have actually not done anything since then or even before that point. So it makes it very, very suspect if they even had the ability to even write something on that line. So it would show that there could have actually been the idea of a coup at that point. And even at the point with it, when we're looking from 97 to current, as you see on the screen, we see that the actual general trust has not risen above any point above 55%. This means that basically is we've had at least a 45% disapproval rating since 1997. This shows that the mainstream media news has been doing something clearly wrong since this point. So this would show that that they're not doing something positive at this point. Yes, there was in 2016, from 2015, there was an 8-point drop. But if you look at the actual coverage, what they were doing during the election season, we see that it was definitely not exactly what we would call an even coverage of how you would want an election to be done. And from what we saw with the WikiLeaks emails that they had gotten had gotten come out from whoever leaked them directly from the DNC, whichever employee was miffed from them, as we have yet to see any evidence to show that it was a Russian, because the actual download speeds do not support any such conspiracy theory of that. The only theory you would support was someone actually doing it directly there, and the only people who've actually had security access were workers there, so we must assume that it was an actual worker at the DNC building itself. So we must assume that. So it was basically someone there was PO'd at them. And this is what's basically, once they released that, it showed that basically the information shows that the presidential campaign of Hillary Clinton was contacting these media groups to essentially do one-sided coverage. And when you have, and this is what leads us to another point, which was that the Clinton campaign was actually weaponizing the term fake news themselves. So when we hear the term fake news, it wasn't coming from Trump, it was actually coming from the Clinton campaign. The Clinton campaign was essentially using this to brand it on anything that was independent or foreign media that might have the possibility of being neutral or harsh toward her campaign, that wasn't essentially taking direct orders from her campaign. This meant basically where Fox was essentially eliminated from this group, as they knew that Fox was going to be essentially neutral to negative to her campaign from a mainstream, but basically anything independent and anything foreign, they essentially felt that they were not to be trusted, and that's what they saw. And while they state down here as Republicans fuel this distrust, we know that what it called that's frankly not really true, as we can see that basically is that we don't see much of a high standard on Democrats. And you can look at the actual mainstream media, as mainstream media itself, from their actual coverage, we can see their coverage has actually slipped to being partisan toward Democratic viewpoints. So this is why you're going to find that. Even if you look at the actual independents themselves, which you'll see in this lighter green, you'll see that they have slipped as well. So blaming this on Republicans themselves, you can't exactly state that, because while they pretty much during from the 97 to about the 2003 stayed pretty standard in their amounts, once they kind of got past that point, there tended to be a really big deviation in the point. But even now we're talking, in today's point, only 51% of Democrats actually approve of of mainstream media coverage. This would be this legacy media that's coming out there. So frankly, we're talking that even they've gotten to the point of not even approving of it. Independents are at a whopping 30%, and Republicans are a whopping 14%. This should give the media a real big surprise of what's going on. So frankly, is what should be looked at is the median should be the independents, and this is showing that basically that if independents are swayed a lot closer to the Republicans, that means we're talking that there is a slide toward Democrats, but a 51% at the current rate is not anything to be proud of. That means 49% of these Democrats, even with a Democratic leaning media, is showing that they have a serious distrust of the media. That means they don't believe that the media is doing their job. And when we go from the age group, we're seeing that basically is the older people tend to be a little more trusting of it. Currently, they've been at their highest point at about what was that, 2003, and then they stayed pretty well at the 2007 point to being 55% and 54%, whereas young people in 2001 were at 55%, but young people right now are at 26%, older people are at 38%. This means you cannot blame people by age, and you cannot state that people are actually having trust based on party. This means there's some type of disconnect that this legacy media is having, and there's some type of ideas that they're pushing that just aren't connecting, or they're not pushing actually for legitimate stories, which means when they're trying to push this idea of Russia hacked the election without any proof, and trying to push these bogus conspiracy theories like this, it shows that they're basically have nothing to do with actual fact. And in this, they try to blame it on the divisive presidential election, but frankly, as if you look at it, you can see when you go back, you can see it's basically been eroding for a long time. And you cannot state that basically when the young people have had essentially a sub 50% approval rating since 2000 of the legacy media since 2008, which would be essentially, we're talking a decade since since this point. We're talking it's a decade since this point, and young people basically, or all the older people have had a sub 50%. Younger people at this point have also had sub 50%. Now, this is a major point that people should note, that if both are actually of sub 50%, that means something is wrong. It's not the fact that there's a divisive election. In fact, you'd have to actually prove that there have been 3 divisive elections. Now, I don't see any evidence of that. In fact, you'd actually have to give me evidence that basically the Trump Clinton election would have to be divisive, the Obama versus Romney election would have to be divisive, and the Obama McCain election would have to be divisive. Now, frankly, if you can basically pull that one out of your backside to prove that all 3 of those were divisive, then you deserve a lot of credit, because that is one big lie, and you really can't prove that. Frankly, we have not seen this one for the actual by age goes back to 2001. This means basically we can't even go back to basically George W. Bush in any stretch of the imagination and even get a 60%. We can't even get a 56% approval rating of the media. This means even for people that even have any type of idea, and I think there was at least some type of consensus from Tea Partiers and Democrats that the war was bad, and even from the liberty-minded people. So I think there would be at least some type of consensus that they should have been able to get one thing right, and that should have been able to get something within this 2003 period. It should have been able to go up. Now, seeing that period averaged between those group of people about 54%, that shows that something's clearly wrong, and that actually did not change, except going up about averaging up about 0.5%, approximately, or about 1.5%. What's that? Yeah, 0.5% up from the previous from actually the previous year. And this shows you right there that they couldn't even manage to get that much. Even 2004, the next year with it showed that basically that they're clearly out of touch by dropping nearly a dozen points for both groups, showing that they are essentially going completely out of whack from what the actual people were looking for. Now, we just supposed to say that this is because there was some type of conspiracy on the people, and there was a contesting on the election. No, there wasn't any contesting on the election, because George W. Bush won that one too, if we look at that. So frankly, if he won that election, it shows that basically they did something clearly wrong during that year, and that basically would have been the coverage of the war still in Iraq and Afghanistan. That shows that they weren't exactly doing their job, and it shows they weren't doing their job even on election coverage. It shows that they were doing something completely wrong, and this was not just older people, but younger people as well. Younger people were slightly higher at 45%. Older people were slightly lower at 44%. It shows that they did not know what the hell they were doing. And when we look at the same time period, we see that basically during this period is basically we're talking that the average was pretty much stays right at that amount within that mid 40s. And we see that Democrats were a little bit higher in 2005, But the fact is this showed that basically during this time that there was a definite flip of how they were trying to handle coverage. That during this time that they were basically trying to, during the 2000s and going on further, that they were going toward more focus on democratic policies in and pushing this in the media. And we're seeing less of an openness in media and more of a closed idea of how things were supposed to be done. And we're seeing even more of this type of indoctrination from the way things were done. Now, what's happening with it is we're seeing more and more people get their news online, which is why we're seeing this change. And that's why we're seeing this number sink so low, because people are stating that they don't want to get their news from this legacy media, which can't do anything right, which miss most of these stories, which focus on stories that don't mean anything. So this is why we get this whole garbage, and why the number has gone from a 53% in 97 for the actual trust in the legacy media down to a 32% in 2016. There should be a real key to them why this has happened, and why basically the best that they've ever gotten is 1976 at a 72%. That's still 28% people who hate what the news is doing. This should be a key to what they've been doing in the first place. If they're actually doing their job, partisanship doesn't matter. That shows that it doesn't matter what's going on. If they're actually doing a quality job and actually doing key reporting, and not just trying to play politics or trying to basically essentially indoctrinate the people in a certain way of thinking, their numbers would actually be much higher than that. They should be much higher than that. And if they're doing their actual job, that's what ends up happening. Because when you go out there and you actually state what's going on, you'll end up getting a different result. Because this is what it's about. Even if they disagree with your opinions of what's going out there, they're still going to state, okay, they're still bringing me the facts, and it's still quality work. Well, when you don't bring them the facts and you bring them garbage, and you try to basically say, our result or end result is trying to essentially get more people to our party that we support, or let's try to impeach the president. Is there any data? To get him impeached that's legitimate, that for any constitutional violations? Well, no, but we want him gone. Well, when you do that garbage, it shows that you're basically doing nothing but indoctrinating people with crap. And that's not what this is about. You're actually supposed to work in journalism. If you want to actually work in activism, get out and go into activism. End your channel and actually go into activism. Change your newspaper and make it just for activism. Just change the whole thing and eliminate all of your other departments within it, and say we're just going to be about activism, and it's just going to be a little newsletter. That's it. Don't, such as the New York Times, such as CNN, such as MSNBC, stop calling yourself news, because you're not news. The Washington Post is another one. These are not news centers. These are actually just centers for left-wing activism. And when you see this, that's basically all it is. They're not giving you any news. And it's fine to be an activist, but basically make sure that you tell people that up front. Don't tell people that, oh, we're a newspaper, we're the most trusted name in news. No, you're not, because you're activists, and that's it. And you're basically presenting garbage. Because when you try to state this is news, well, no, it's not. This is opinion. When you try to state that, hey, we think we got Trump on Russia, well, is this facts, or is this just opinion and bringing some analyst out who doesn't really know what they're talking about because he really is totally disconnected from the situation, and he just has a grievance with Trump or something. Well, if that's the case, well, then get out. Because frankly, you're just contributing to more of this fake news. You're ruining it for the actual independent and foreign journalists that are actually trying to do their job. And you're making those people who are actually doing their job look bad. And these people like Anderson Cooper, like Don Lemon, they need to cut out the garbage because they're frankly not even doing a legitimate job. They're making people that actually are journalists look bad. There are citizen journalists out there that actually want to do good work, and they're basically destroying the name of journalism just because they have a vendetta against a certain party and a certain group of beliefs. And if you like this, like, subscribe, click the notification bell, share this everywhere you can. You could probably end up checking out my Facebook page for my podcast links that I post there. I even have a link there to the subscribe button on the Facebook. And you will also see I have my Twitter page. It's at BigJoe1221. So you can go there and check that out as well. I'll post different things there that you can check out. Plus, there's other different things that'll show up on my page there that I'm commenting on and such. That you can kind of keep track of me as well on there. And I will see you guys later. Bye.